want to thank everyone for coming. My name is Paul Matthews. I'm the Executive Director of the Worcester Regional Research Bureau. I'm 1/3 of the staff. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Eric Nealand in the back of the room, one of my colleagues, and we're going to be joined by Tom Quinn later, who's our researcher. We're a 35-year-old nonprofit. We're focused on researching public policy issues that affect Greater Worcester and educating the public and policymakers on opportunities and challenges confronting the region. I want to thank the DCU Center and Jim Moen, who does yeoman's work on a wide range of issues, for graciously hosting today's forum. And I want to thank the Worcester Education Collaborative, our partner on this, and I mean that in every sense of the term. Both Jen Davis-Carey and Clara O'Rourke and Eric and I have been working together on this since, I believe, December, since I think the signing ceremony for SOA. So it's nice to have this come to fruition, and it's been wonderful working with both of you and your leadership. I also want to thank Mayor Petty, Superintendent Benenda, and the entire school committee, especially Vice Chair Jack Foley, who's here today, for the effort that they're undertaking on SOA funding, running 4 different forums across the community, with the first having taken place on Monday. And the second, yes, you can do this tomorrow night too. Please do put on your schedule to go to Burncode at 6 p.m. tomorrow in order to hear from the school department on the SOA funding and offer your input as to the best potential use of those funds. The first meeting Monday night had great turnout and really good feedback, and we're looking forward to the other sessions March 2nd at Doherty and March 4th at North, and we're also looking forward to other opportunities to provide input online and elsewhere. The school committee is to be commended for making this such an effort. Jack, in particular, is spending 3 nights this week on this topic, so speaking publicly on it, so I want to thank him, and I know he's joined by John Monfredo, and if there are other members of the school committee in the crowd who I missed, I apologize. I do want to thank all the panelists for coming out today. Given what's happening statewide with the Student Opportunity Act, they are all experts on this topic, and they're all in exceedingly high demand. So we really appreciate that they took the time and trouble to come out today, not just for one forum, but for 2. So those who want part 2, please do stick around for 6:30, and you can hear the next take on this. On that note, I do want to turn it over to Jen Davis-Carey, my friend and colleague, who's now going to actually provide the substance of today's program.
Thank you all, and thank you panelists for crossing the great 495 barrier and heading out to Worcester. Thank you all for being here. As you know, the Student Opportunity Act is the first major amendment to how our state funds public schools in nearly 30 years. It is a major piece of legislation and is a result of the work of educators, of community members, of members of the legislature, and also of students to get this passed. And it really does will make over the 7 years before we get to full funding, each year will make a dramatic difference in how we approach the work of teaching and learning in the Commonwealth. This evening's event is to really give all of us a background and understanding from a variety of perspectives of the Act, what it means, and what it can mean for public education here in Worcester. Let me quickly introduce our panelists. Jenny Curtin is with Barr Foundation, and Jenny will be talking about, as Barr refers to it, the North Star, the direction that we should all be looking to in terms of what we want our kids to know and be able to do when they finish high school. Natasha Usherminsky is with the Education Trust and is the Massachusetts director. She has been very involved in questions of equity and the work of equity that this act will allow us to proceed with. Laura, I'm going to butcher your last name. Laura Dzorny is with the Rennie Center for Education and Public Policy. Rennie Center can pull back the lens in many ways and give us the wide-angle look as opposed to the Worcester-specific look, and Laura will be talking about that. Ben Foreman is with Mass Inc., And Ben has been working a lot on issues related to local accountability and community accountability as a complement to the state accountability and very quantitative measures that the state requires in terms of educational progress. And Jack Foley, as you know, is a member of the school committee, and Jack's subcommittee, Finance and Operations, has been charged with a lot of the work associated with this. And Jack will be taking us down to a local level and what this means for our 44 schools here in Worcester. For the next 10 minutes, I'd like you all to take a look at the posters that we have up around the room, looking at some of the data that is specific to our district, and some of it is comparative data related to the district compared to our sister cities and towns. As you look at that, you also have on your seats some sticky notes. If you could jot down what your reactions to that are, to the various data points, and just put them on the appropriate poster. That will give us an idea of what you all are thinking relative to the work at hand. This is all going to be compiled in a report that we will be submitting to the district and the school committee as these community conversations come to a close. Over the next month, as Paul said, beginning on Monday, a series of community conversations began. There will be one more at Burncoat High School in this month, and then two more the first week of March. One at Doherty High School and one at North High School. So keep an eye out for those. Those are very intimate conversations looking at what where we should be getting a community input into where we think these new resources should go. In addition, several of our community organizations will be hosting forums. So keep an eye out on regular media and social media for information about those. So I'm going to give you all 10 minutes. I don't have my bell to ring. So I will come back up here when it's time for us to convene again. Okay, thank you, folks. We'll get started with our next section. I know that some of the data is excellent. Some of the other data is troubling, but it does mean that we have work to do together as a district. This is not all work of the professionals at 20 Irving Street or in our 44 schools. This is work for every one of us who has a vested interest in education, and that's anyone living, working, breathing, strolling through Worcester has a vested interest in this work. So, that said, let's think about the data now.
You won't get confirmation back, but in a moment you should see the words that you submitted on the screen. essentially what you're seeing on the screen, the larger the word, the more people responded to that specific word. So you can see the largest words right now. So counselors is the largest, then discipline, then guidance. I'm assuming a lot of people submitted guidance counselors together. Alrighty, we're going to move on to the next question. Has everyone submitted? Oh yeah, I'll specify that. Thanks, Tony. So if you are writing something that's multiple words, for example, guidance counselor, if you put a dash in between those, that will allow it to come as one unified word, opposed to putting a space. So for the next question, it will be. What area or areas are most urgent for the district and community to focus on? So you can now submit another text message. You don't have to go through the same Jennifer Care, just submit the one or multiple word response. For those of you who might not be able to see the screen from far, the two largest words right now are diversity and discipline. Has everyone had a chance to respond? Just look at me and kind of like nod. Yeah? Okay, so it's
Okay, panelists, are you guys ready? All right, why don't we begin? Jenny Curtin.
Great. Let's move this around. Can folks hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. So thanks again for having me here today on this panel. I thought I would just start with a really brief overview of who BARR is, because I know it might not be a familiar name for everyone in the room. So BARR Education program is situated at the BARR Foundation, which is based in Boston. We're a regional foundation doing programmatic work in several areas, education being one of them. And I lead our strategy area that we call Catalyze New Models, which is really thinking about how do we support all schools to be excellent options, high school options for students. And so it's really focused on the high school end of the education work. And it's based on a belief that all students can be successful in learning, in work, and in life. And the "and" there is very intentional, that it's not an either-or proposition, but really about setting all students up for success in all three of those areas. And we deeply believe that that doesn't happen by accident, that we need to intentionally design schools and systems that are responsive to who the students are, and a deep understanding of those individual students, their families, and the community at large. So we are not promoting a BARR model of what high school education should look like. We have some philosophical pillars that I can describe around what we hope to see in every high school education setting that will support students to reach success in learning, work, and life. But that looks different in every area because each context is unique. And so the philosophical pillars are around the tenets of positive youth development, that all students are held to high expectations, that all students have a primary person, a person that knows them well, both adults and peers, that they have relevant learning experiences that are meaningful to them, and the communities that they are coming from and what their ambitions are and goals are over the longer term. And that they have opportunities to contribute to their learning environment, that they have a voice that has significance and is not only listened to, but shapes the learning environment, both in individual classrooms, but the overall school. And we also, to do that, we think that learning has to be deeply personalized. So you have to really get to know your students in an authentic way to be able to respond to them and be able to hold them to high expectations with the right supports. So we, knowing that this doesn't happen by accident and these sorts of learning environments need to be intentionally designed, we think about the region of New England, which is the region in which we work and that we are supporting high school design efforts, as needing multiple entry points. That we know that some people have been on this journey about thinking about high school design and what the next version of high school design is to really meet the needs of all students and get to excellence for a long time, and then that others are newer to this. And so we operate in lots of different ways. And I think I was invited here today because Worcester, as a district, has been one of our grantees, and they've been part of a project that we call the Planning for Post-Secondary Success Project. And they're one of 5 urban districts from across New England, not just within Massachusetts, but across all of New England that have participated in this particular project. And the project is oriented to really making a case for change. So deeply understanding who your students are, both quantitatively and qualitatively. What are the experiences of current students, and what are the experiences of alumni, in order to better understand in a more deep and meaningful way what the root causes of inequities are, and root causes of things, of sources, gaps, and some of the concerns that we see in the data. Better understand that in order to then plan to go forward. It's sort of like a going slow to go fast. We do a lot of that in our support of our work, that a lot of times people don't have the resources and the time to slow down, to do really thoughtful planning. And I think it's a great role for philanthropy to think about how we can support and provide the resources to be able to free up folks to do that going slow and thoughtful planning to go fast. So Worcester, over the last year, among the other 4 districts that have been participating in this project, have received support to deeply understand the experiences in classrooms of students in Worcester high schools, the experience of students as they leave Worcester high schools in post-secondary education, and make meaning of that, which is really hard and complicated work when you really dig into like the multiple data sources and having to triangulate and make meaning of that. And so that work has culminated for all 5 districts in thinking about what's next. Like now that we've spent time really sitting with the data for over many months and receiving support to do that, what do we now need to do in response to this? That's not about adding a program on that's a layering on, but more of like how do we fundamentally and foundationally redesign what we're doing to be responsive to what we're seeing in the data. And so that is not something you can just flip the switch on. That's an evolution, and again it's sort of like a going slow to go fast sort of proposition. And so Worcester, alongside the other districts that are in this project, most of them realized through the deep data reflection process that one thing that was missing to be able to really advance the work in a meaningful way was setting a vision around what all high school graduates should know and be able to do by the time they earn a diploma. And so that's work that Worcester's engaged in, and we actually have a now separate project for a lot of other districts across New England to deeply engage in this work, because without knowing what that North Star is, to Jen's earlier point, it's really hard to then design a responsive education environment. You have to know what you're aiming for and backwards map from that. And so I think it's really an exciting time for Worcester. The Student Opportunity Act has come as sort of a light the timing is really promising that there is some nice synergy, because one of the things we think a lot about is that people often get ahead of themselves in thinking about the solutions before fully understanding the problem, and then thinking about like what the vision is to address the problem again before jumping to solutions. And Worcester's in the thick of that already at the same time that the Student Opportunity Act is unfolding. And so it's an incredible opportunity to align around the vision of what we all want, and that's a community conversation around what we all want our students to know and be able to do at high school graduation time, and align that with what then the educational environment looks like for all students to be responsive to reach that overarching North Star vision. So I think I'll stop there and pass it on to the next person.
Hi, everybody. I'm Natasha Shemirsky with the Education Trust. I will also start by just telling you a little bit about the organization that I work for. You'll also see me kind of leaning back a little bit because I'm trying to see the slides that you guys are seeing on the screen. I thought about coming up to the podium, but I think I'm too short for that to be helpful. So bear with me a little bit. So the Education Trust is a nonprofit education advocacy organization that's based in Washington, D.C., and that has existed for well over 20 years at this point, and that focuses squarely on eliminating disparities in opportunity and achievement that affect so many low-income students, students of color, English learners, and students with disabilities in our country. And we do our work in sort of a number of different ways. We do lots of research and policy, data analysis to kind of understand what causes the gaps that we see in the system and what can be done to address them. Do lots of advocacy to push those ideas out. And we also provide sort of technical assistance directly to districts and sometimes to schools, state agencies, as well as to advocates on the ground who are trying to create change in their own communities. And so we have a really small team here in Massachusetts and are very proud to work with a number of partners. We're up to about, I think, 21 partners total in the Massachusetts Education Equity Partnership. The Massachusetts Education Equity Partnership is a collective effort of social justice, civil rights, and education organizations from across the states. You can see examples of our partners on the screen. That's really kind of coming from, works with different constituencies, but these organizations all have come together because they all believe that we need to do better for our low-income students and students of color in Massachusetts. You may be familiar with our number one for some report that came out about a year and a half ago. Take a look at it. It kind of portrays a lot of very similar data to what you saw here during the data walk, just for the state as a whole. We, over the last few months, have been really involved in kind of advocacy around the Student Opportunity Act, and especially around making sure that those funding increases came through, absolutely a critical piece, right, of the work, but also that there were incentives and even some requirements in the law for districts to take steps to use those dollars to improve opportunity and outcomes for historically underserved students. So if you take nothing else from what I'm about to say, right, let's remember that the Student Opportunity Act is at its core a piece of civil rights legislation. Right? The majority of the increases in funding in the law are coming through funding to support additional supports for low-income students and English learners. And that's something we just have to keep coming back to as we think about how we use these dollars moving forward. The Student Opportunity Act is going to pretty dramatically increase resources for especially our highest need districts over the next 7-year period. We're getting sort of the first installment this year, and then going to get additional installments as we move forward. It also requires all districts to revisit how they're performing for each individual group of students and to develop a plan for how they're going to improve student learning experiences and outcomes. And because those plans have to be created with input from the community and from families, it really creates this opportunity to open up decision-making tables, right? As you all know, oftentimes the families and the students who are most affected by what we decide to do with the funding that we get in terms of changes in practices don't get to be in some of these conversations. And the Student Opportunity Act actually requires district leaders to take that feedback into account. So let's go a little bit deeper for a second on this idea of educational equity. I think oftentimes when we start talking about educational improvement efforts, whether on purpose or not, we often almost imagine the world as if we were starting from a place of equality, right? As if we were starting, and I want to be clear that these graphics are not mine. They are, and there are lots of graphics out there to try to kind of have a conversation about education equity. This one is from the Center for Urban Education, and it's my new kind of favorite set of graphics to portray these ideas, right? So oftentimes, if we sort of do the same thing and provide the same thing to all students, we're assuming that all students are starting from the same place and having similar experiences, right? We know that's not the case. We know that our white and our higher income students are getting all sorts of supports, both within the system and outside the system, that give them a big leg up, right? And to make things even more complicated, that's actually not the full picture either. When we look at the experiences of our most underserved students, our students of color from low-income backgrounds often don't speak English, right? We have layers upon layers of, frankly, racist and classist structures within our system, both in our education system and outside of it, but make that essentially lead to that ladder being broken on top of being longer. So when we think about equity, when we think about what we need to do, and where we focus our resources. If we were to spread the money out and just add more of the same, it's like adding a block at the bottom of that last picture, right? Everybody might start a little bit higher up, but we're still going to keep those inequities and the ladders are still going to stay broken. And I think the question and the challenge for all of us as we think about implementation of this law is how do we change that? So the most recent report that the Massachusetts Education Equity Partnership released last week, it's called Troubling Trends, Promising Opportunities, Moving Forward with a Focus on Equity, puts forth some ideas for how district leaders can leverage the law, the Student Opportunity Act, both the requirements in that law, because we know sometimes, frankly, it's helpful to have the political cover, right, to make some of those hard changes on the ground, and as well as, of course, the funding that is going to be coming to districts in this year and in future years, to really try to focus on that kind of broken ladder in that previous image, right? So a few ideas I want to share with you at a high level, and then happy to go into more depth later. As I mentioned before, a lot of the increase in resources that we're seeing is coming through resources to provide additional supports to economically disadvantaged students and English learners. We've got to make sure that those resources are actually reaching the kids that they're meant to support. Oftentimes now, even when resources reach districts, they wind up being spread out much more evenly, and sometimes even in ways where our wealthier schools within a district get more of the resources than schools serving our highest need students in the same district. This has been well documented both in Massachusetts and across the country, right? So got to change that. This family and community engagement piece is absolutely key, right? We have one of our partners is the Urban League of Springfield, and Henry Thomas, who heads up that organization, has this way of saying, you know, you got to leverage the love, right? You got to leverage the love and the knowledge and the capacity of our families who actually know their students best and know what their students best. Let's talk to them. Let's ask them what they need from their schools that they're not getting right now. We need to think about, you know, the costs of education have shifted, certainly over the last 26 years, but so has what we know about education and what works and what doesn't work for kids. And we got to focus on those things that work, and especially things that work not just for everybody, but that work for our historically underserved students. So just to give you one example, right, we could invest funding in expanding course offerings and providing more advanced learning opportunities, be they even early college programs, be they dual enrollment, be they AP classes, just widen the array, right? If we just do that and we just increase course offerings, I almost guarantee you one of the things we're going to see is that our white higher income students are better positioned right now to take advantage of those opportunities. right? So we're going to see big increases in the populations of kids, maybe even on average, who are taking those classes, maybe even succeeding in those classes. But when we peel back the average and we look at who's actually getting access, it's not going to look so great, right? So we have to also ask ourselves, what additional supports do we need to have in place in order to truly open up the doors to our students and to students who often get locked out of those opportunities right now. Equally important, and we actually in our paper specifically call out this idea of windows and mirrors, making sure that all kids have windows and mirrors in their schools, that they can, this is something that research has shown kind of over and over, to learn, kids need to see themselves reflected in their curriculum and in their classroom, as well as to be able to learn about the experiences of others. And right now, frankly, our students of color are mostly getting windows. Our white students are mostly getting mirrors. This is actually kind of hurting students from across the board. So how do we change that? Both, we saw educator diversity, I think is the poster that got some of the strongest responses over kind of during the data walk. Also saw it pop up in the word clouds, right? Clearly that's something that's on folks' minds, and that is something we have to work on. We also have to look at what kids are learning in the classroom today, and think about how we can leverage our curricular materials to provide those windows and mirrors even as we work to diversify the teacher workforce. And importantly, how we support our educators in making those shifts in the curriculum. A lot of our educators right now are not prepared to take on these topics of race and class in the classroom, right, that are gonna come up. So how do we provide them with the training and the coaching, because this is not a one-time conversation, in order to make that shift happen. And lastly, we got to monitor the success of what we're doing. And monitoring success is not just about looking at average shifts. Got to disaggregate. I think the rule of thumb is disaggregate everything. Disaggregate it as much as you possibly can. Because as I mentioned, with those course enrollments going up, for example, enrollment for whom, right? Opportunity for whom? Who's getting access? And if we see that the numbers are not going up, be they for graduation rates or for dropout rates or for access to advanced coursework or assessment results, whatever it be, if we're not seeing movement for our low-income students and students of color, for our English learners, we're not doing it right? So we got to come back to the drawing board and figure out what else we need to do.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm, again, Laura DeSorni from the Rennie Center for Education, Research, and Policy. Following the trend, just to give you a little background, we are an independent, nonpartisan research and policy organization based in Boston, but really focused statewide, and committed to making sure that decision-making in education is based on deep knowledge and evidence of effective practice. So that's a little about us, but honestly, I'm here today more to talk about the work that you all and the rest of the community in Worcester did that we were just privileged to be able to help support, which is the Worcester strategic planning process that took place in 2017 and 2018. So the Rennie Center was helping to facilitate that process throughout, and I have to say, I think it was really a model for community engagement that a lot of other places across the state could learn from. Throughout the process, we had direct engagement with more than 400 individual community members. We heard from almost 200 more through a survey that we put out. We had about 70 people who were engaged on a regular basis as part of a number of different committees and subcommittees. I see some nodding heads, meaning some of you were probably on those committees or subcommittees. So, it really was, again, very much a community-based effort, and it shows, I think, the commitment in Worcester to having conversations about what's going to happen in the schools be not just grounded in the community and led by it, but also something that there will be ongoing ownership for. So what I want to talk through today really and focus on mostly is how does what came out of that strategic planning process, how does that align with some of the priorities we're seeing in the Student Opportunity Act? So in the Worcester Strategic Plan, we ended up with 5 focus areas ultimately. Those were commitment to, I'm going to mix up my lists if I don't look at it. So culture of innovation, academic excellence, welcoming schools, investing in educators, and technology and operations. So it covers a very broad range. But I'm going to focus on 4 areas today, and the reason I'm picking these is in the Student Opportunity Act, what we see is a real focus on a certain defined set of evidence-based interventions or programs. So the law requires every district to put forth a plan of how they're going to use the funding that's coming to them over the next 3 years. And it also states specifically 9 different areas of what, again, are called evidence-based programs, systems, or interventions that these funds could be used for. So out of those 9, 4 of them are really very closely aligned and come up over and over again in the strategic plan. And so I'm going to talk through those 4 specifically. And you should see, yep, okay, great. So we have the graphic over there that you see on the screen is pulled directly from the strategic plan. This is the vision for Worcester Public Schools in 2023. So the plan itself covers the years 2018 to 2023, those 5 years. And I'm not going to read through this, but what you'll see as I go through these 4 priority areas out of the overall planning process is that a lot of what we are seeing as evidence-based interventions in the Student Opportunity Act are really, again, echoed and brought up over and over in the strategic plan and are part of this vision. So the first of those is purchase of curriculum materials aligned with the state curriculum frameworks. And the way that this manifests in the strategic plan is 2 ways primarily. One is a focus on early intervention, so building a strong foundation for students, both in early literacy and early math up through 6th grade. So we see a focus on expanding effective interventions for the youngest students, and not just expanding them to all students, but actually figuring out which ones work by piloting them in individual schools and then rolling them out district-wide. So that would be very much aligned with this idea of curriculum and purchasing and using effective curriculum. On the other end of the spectrum, the strategic plan also really dives deeply into the idea of digital literacy and computer science, which again, you'll see if you go through that document, comes up in almost every section, this need to really make sure that students are able to build the digital skills and computer skills that they need to thrive in the workplace. And so in terms of curriculum, you see both a focus on creating a curriculum around digital literacy and computer science and creating some classes and coursework that students can access, and also making sure, frankly, that students can access those skills in every class, because it shouldn't be something that's confined to one. And so on both of those sides, when it comes to the Student Opportunity Act's focus on using funds for effective curriculum, again, it's really about building the foundation and making sure students have all of the skills they need to thrive throughout their educational career and into their future careers as well. So that's one. The second area that we see is a real focus on college and career readiness. So the wording in the Student Opportunity Act is developing additional pathways to strengthen college and career readiness. And there are a lot of different ways that the strategic plan focuses on this, but one real area of priority is on career development, both career exploration, career awareness, and then also actually career experiences. And so when I talk about the strategic planning process being a true community-led process, this is one area we really saw a lot of deep community involvement, was thinking about how can students not just learn about careers, not just have an opportunity to meet with a guidance counselor or a mentor, someone in a school to understand their own interests, aptitudes, and preferences for careers, but how do they get out into the community? How do they get out of the school building, go to a business, go to a community organization, and have a chance to really get some hands-on support, understanding what that career looks like in practice? And so that's something that I think you'll see a lot of crossover between what the Student Opportunity Act funds can be used for and what the community is saying. Not only are they interested in, but they're prepared to help support and drive forward, certainly from the business and community leader perspective. The third area, besides curriculum and career exploration, is in social service or support services to support students' social and emotional needs and development. And so this was something that came out in a couple of different ways in the strategic plan. We saw both a focus on systems and on training. So when I say systems, that really means the ability of schools and the district as a whole to set a vision for what this should look like in schools, and not just have the vision for it, but really back it up with data. So being able to identify which students have particular needs and then be able to plan interventions that directly address what those needs are. So this could be something, if you think about it from a mental health perspective, are we able to distinguish between a student who, say, has some moderate anxiety and a student who is likely to be in crisis sometime soon and really needs a direct intervention and support and some real significant additional help as well from school mental health personnel or otherwise. So that's one thing, is this focus on building systems and using data to inform practices. There's also a recognition that, frankly, teachers are not trained mental health professionals, nor should they be. That's not the expectation. But what can we expect of all teachers, all educators, everyone in a school building when it comes to understanding how do we work effectively with students and build relationships effectively? So how do we focus on trauma-informed practices, supporting behavioral health, again, mental health supports, those sorts of things. So really making sure that at a baseline level, everyone within the building or everyone within every school building is prepared to support the holistic needs of students. So that's number 3. The 4th area of the Student Opportunity Act, the priority area, that's again really echoed in the strategic plan and has already been brought up tonight, is teacher workforce, and particularly diversifying the teacher workforce. So if you see on the graphic, that's something that's really underlying the foundation of the whole edifice, is focusing on building a more diverse teacher pipeline. And so in the strategic plan, you'll see a lot of different ways to address that, both by building stronger partnerships and pathways with local programs. Obviously, a lot of local programs exist to support teacher workforce development, so how are we making sure there are connections between those programs and getting those teachers actually into the schools and working with the students here. Beyond that, it's about looking beyond locally and thinking, how do we start making more deep and lasting connections with other national and other programs across the state that are really preparing educators to work specifically in urban settings, working with students of color, addressing some of the needs that you might see among a student population that does include a lot of low-income and immigrant students who often have somewhat different needs and cultural backgrounds and expectations. So how are we getting teachers who are well-versed and sharing the culture of the students in the classrooms into the classrooms to work with Worcester students? So those are really the 4 key areas I wanted to highlight. And again, you'll see echoes of that throughout the diagram that's up there. The last thing I want to say is, we've mentioned this already tonight, the importance of family and community engagement. And this is something that is not only part of the strategic plan, it's also required, again, under the Student Opportunity Act. So it's something the community I know is very committed to doing no matter what, but it's also something that will be required as we go through the process of planning the district plan now, and as it undergoes both revisions and renewals in future years as well. And so a couple of the ways that the strategic planning process envisioned that family engagement taking place. Again, first of all, you'll see a theme here, partnering with community-based organizations that do a lot of work already on the ground with families, with parents, especially those who might not be as willing or feel as welcome in the schools, or might not be able to come by and want to get involved in that way. So that's one. Actually, there is a recommendation also for a bilingual parent advisory council in the Worcester strategic plan. So you can see that, again, the community and the school system is already thinking very deeply and very critically about how are we engaging parents in new and different ways, particularly parents who might not otherwise feel welcome in the school building or able to share what they know and all the support and love that they bring for their students. So those are just a few of the ways that there's a lot of this overlap between what the community has brought up through this process and what will be kind of the priorities and the different options for the district going forward. Happy to talk more about either the strategic plan or what we see as some great areas of focus, but honestly I think a lot of the work's already been done, which is fantastic, and the groundwork's been laid, and it's just about picking that up and moving the ball forward now that there's some additional resources attached.
Okay. Again, I'm Ben Foreman. I'm a research director at MassInc. MassInc's a small nonprofit. We work on making sure there's economic opportunity for all in our Commonwealth, and our focus has been gateway cities, the communities like Worcester across the state that have traditionally been launching pads for generations of family that have moved up the economic ladder and found a stable place in our state's middle class. I want to start by going back about 7 years ago to 2013 when we brought mayors, superintendents, teachers, principals, community leaders from gateway cities together at Clark. I think Jack was with us that day. I think it was just about this time of year we started at the beginning of 2013 to come up with a vision for education in gateway cities that could be shared and all these communities could work toward together. And we must have had 100 people in the room, and we didn't agree on much in that first day. But the concept that everybody subscribed to was really clear, and that was that our gateway cities should be a place of excellence in learning. And that this notion that urban communities are somehow inferior to suburbs when it comes to schools is absurd when our gateway cities have the college and university partners. At the other end of the spectrum, they've been doing early learning for years and years and have built strong early learning systems that all working families need. Our gateway cities have the cultural and ethnic diversity, linguistic diversity, all sorts of things that enrich our learning. They have the voc schools, they have the employer partners, everything that makes up the kind of 21st century learning experience we want for children, our gateway cities almost uniquely have access to. So why do we keep thinking that we're somehow behind the others? And the urgency for this was that since ed reform in '93, every single year our gateway city school districts became increasingly low income. And all the schools have become places that sociologists would call schools with concentrated levels of poverty, where students were gonna underperform their potential because of that concentration of poverty. So we had this vision, everybody believed in it. We talked about things like dual language immersion, where students are educated in 2 languages, and when they come out, they can speak both languages fluently. We talked about things like early college, where students are close to completing an associate's degree when they graduate high school. We talked about the early learning opportunities that are so important, especially if you want to build economically integrated classrooms. You can't have half the students starting out with all kinds of structured learning and the other half arriving with having had nothing prior to kindergarten. We know that doesn't work. We talked about all these sort of evidence-based models, and they all happen to cost a little extra money, but they produced a whole lot more, and so it was clearly a worthy investment. But the money wasn't there, and actually each year from 2013 on, superintendents and principals began by looking at their budgets and thinking about where they were going to have to cut and how they could cut. And they were losing services and innovations that they had actually worked hard to build and demonstrate success with. So we turned our attention to advocating for the Student Opportunity Act and talking about how egregious it was that each year we were assigning budgets saying we were giving more to education than ever before, and clearly ignoring that we weren't fulfilling the commitment to gateway cities and our public schools that we had made in '93. And not only that, we weren't willing to even have a conversation about, was that number adequate? Did we need more resources to meet the increasingly high standards we're setting? So, we tried to make that point. While we did that, we also started thinking about accountability, because in our conversations about this vision, superintendents and principals made clear that the things that you were talking about doing or we're talking about doing, the state currently wouldn't give us any credit for. We graduate a student who can speak Spanish fluently and has a seal of biliteracy. How are we credited for that effort? Or we have a student arrive in kindergarten who's ready for kindergarten. How are we credited for that investment? Or we have a student who goes off and completes their associate's degree 1 year after high school. All the department's going to want to talk to us about is our 8th grade MCAS score or our dropout rate. So how do we get the accountability structure right? Accountability came up in this Student Opportunity Act a lot. A lot of people said we should repeat the formula of '93. There should be more accountability for more money. And we want to make sure those gateway cities deliver on our taxpayers' investment, which is perfectly reasonable. But we took the position that accountability should come from the communities, because each of them know their strengths and they also know their weaknesses, and they know where they can best place this money and how they can demonstrate success with that. So I really like the model that the legislature came up with, where each community is going to produce these plans. They're going to lay out a discrete number of things that we're going to do with these dollars, and we're going to show how we're going to measure them. And the state will look over your shoulder to make sure that your plan is real and that you're adhering to it. I think that's a really nice reciprocal relationship and the way to get towards the kind of learning we envision for our gateway city. So a couple of weeks ago, I just wrote a little bit about how the state should offer guidance to communities in the spirit of that sort of an approach, which we would really call a local accountability approach. So a couple of things that we thought were important. One, the state obviously, if you're giving you the choice to determine what you want to do with the money, you should determine what the measures are and how you're going to demonstrate success and know whether what you're doing is working. And I think the state guidance the commissioner put out last week honored that. He said, here's some measures that you could use, but we are welcome to you using other measures if you can defend them. I think that's great. We went a step further and said you should even sort of think about an outside consultant to help you to develop those measures so you can really show that they're rigorous. some people were critical of that, saying, where's $500,000 going to come from to hire app to do this work? But I'm sure Jack has friends at Clark that could help you think about, okay, this is your strategy. Here's a couple of ways that you would want to benchmark that are valid. And in terms of setting the goals, in the past we used to set goals by what sounded good, right? Oh, it doesn't sound like we're really stretching, so maybe make that target a little higher. That's no way to go about a real strategy. So I think your goals should be based on the investment. This is an evidence-based program. We know if we serve 20 students or 40 students or 200 students through this program, it's going to get us an X% increase. So we can actually defend where that number came from, and everybody's on the same page about our ability to get there based on what we've been able to invest in that program. A couple other things, or I guess I'm all running out of time, so one last thing. And this is probably the more controversial point, and I'll drop it out there and let Jack respond to it. But, to the extent that there's money, it's important that the district don't spend every dime of it, and that the school communities have some. Because cities are actually patchworks of neighborhoods, and neighborhoods are important, right? We need to build the social capital of neighborhoods in order for people to be safe and supportive of one another and looking after each other's kids. And the way you build social capital in neighborhoods is through the public school that serves that neighborhood. And that public school should be a school community with its own vision, with its own culture, and parents and community members should serve on the school site council. They should come up with a strategy and then have money to invest in that strategy. And right now, since the '93 law, we've had school councils on paper, but we haven't had them in practice. And one reason why is because there's not really a job to do. If principals can't spend any money, they can't determine anything, it's all set for them, then why are you asking a parent to come and sit in this meeting and say something when it's going to go in one ear out the other, whether we want it to be that way or not? So I think we can talk all we want about parent engagement, but until we're willing to set up governance structures that allow parents to engage in a meaningful way, we're kind of wasting their time. Laura and I were at a meeting last night where an educator asked, I can't get parents to come and do anything. Well, you're not giving them anything to do. Here's your chance to give them something meaningful to do, and I think we've seen in cities that have done that, like Chicago, it works. So the only other point I don't want to pass up the microphone without making is, we need to work on improving that governance at the school council level. That's going to take a lot of thought and effort by organizations like the Worcester Education Collaborative. But we also got to do something about school committee structures that produce representation that's not reflective of the school communities. That layer of governance is very important. Even if we do devolve some of it down to school councils, districts will continue to play a very important role, and you can't have only one neighborhood represented perpetually, or only, we don't have the cultural and racial and ethnic diversity reflected on the student populations. We know the challenges that result when we continue to operate that way. Lowell has moved away from that. I was in Haverhill a couple weeks ago. They're working very hard to move away from that. And I know that there's ongoing conversations in Worcester about change here as well. And I think this is exactly the right time to do it as you prepare and organize to get the most from the Student Opportunity Act.
Great, thanks, Ben. You should know, first of all, that everything begins at Clark, unless that's WPI, so they're all set. I like my colleague John Monfredo, who's here today, and everybody wants to know, how is Worcester going to spend the money, right? Well, I'm not going to talk about that tonight because we're not there yet. I'll talk briefly about the process that we're undertaking here in Worcester, talk a bit about what fiscal year 21 looks like relative to funding, but also reemphasize that community feedback that we're going to be getting through this process needs to drive strategic investments that we are going to make in Worcester in order to reduce the achievement gaps. And that's really going to come from the community, has to be driven by data, and it has to be looking at evidence base as well. So that's still in front of us. I'll start first by just a minute about Worcester's role in advocating for the funding. And even going back before that meeting at Clark, Worcester was really leading the effort. Brian Allen, who's our chief financial officer, was really a key player across the state in driving this issue around the gap in the urbans, the gateway cities. And for many, many years now, we've been talking about a $90+ million gap in Worcester for what we really should be funded by under the Ed Reform Act. And so Worcester, with Brian Allen and school committee member Tracy Novick and others, really leading the way through MASBO and really driving this, and to begin to create that Foundation Budget Review Commission. Then after the commission's report, Mayor Joe Petty helped lead a statewide effort, really to drive this, looking for funding that we now are getting through the Student Opportunities Act. As mentioned before, under the state mandate, we need to solicit community feedback in order to develop a 3-year strategic plan for how we're going to invest these new resources. We are conducting 4 different forums, as was mentioned, and I'll point out that typically my Finance and Operations Committee will hold budget hearings, but the mayor felt this was so important that we are convening the full school committee in every quadrant across the city in order to solicit feedback from the community about where these investments should go. We are having table discussions about these 9 strategic areas that were mentioned earlier, and getting the prioritization from the folks who are there relative to where those dollars should be invested. And they're actually doing dot voting as well, similar in a less technological way than tonight, but asking people for their feedback. There are other groups that are holding forums across the city. The Latino Education Institute held a forum. We'll get that feedback. The Worcester Educational Justice Alliance has held a forum. We know that WEC is holding the forum here. So we'll be getting feedback from other community groups. We are asking the site councils to provide feedback, the Citywide Parent Advisory Council, the Special Education Parent Advisory Council, and the English Language Learner Parent Advisory Council as well. Our professional educators are being solicited for their views, student advisory groups, online submissions, as well as written submissions. So we're trying to cast a large net out there to get as much feedback as we can. The administration will then take this feedback and prepare a proposed strategic investment plan that they will then present to the school committee. The plan has to be data-driven. It has to look to reduce the achievement gap. We will be looking at this, and we will be voting at our March 19th meeting in order to be ready to submit to the state by April 1st. A little bit about the financial impact, the good news and the bad news. Worcester expects to receive about $98 million over the next 7 years. $98 million in new funding, not inflation. For this year, we're getting $15.7 million in new funding, slightly higher than what would be the $14 million average per year. We're also picking up inflation of about $7.7 million, which is about 2%. That inflation number is below what the current inflation is, so there's actually a loss of dollars there, if you would. We've also seen a modest enrollment decline this year of about 400 students. That will reduce our amount by $4.2 million, leaving really a total dollar amount of about $19.1 million that we can use for next year's budget. From that, you deduct the charter school and school choice costs of about $264,000. And then we have about $2.9 million in the current budget that we will not see renewed funding for next year. Some of it's extended learning time, some maybe some grants, and foregoing the conversation about whether we want to continue those programs or not. If we want to continue those programs, then you reduce the total amount by $2.9 million, leaving about $16 million available. Now, the important number here is that it costs us about $14 million a year to maintain our existing services. So from that $16 million, you need to deduct $14.1 million if we're going to maintain our current services. So at the end of the day, we have about $1.9 million this year in new funding available to invest. Now that's a bit daunting. We feel a bit better by recognizing that it's a 7-year plan, so we should be seeing significant dollars for the next 6 years. But also, without the new funding getting in from the Student Opportunity Act money this year, we would be looking at $11 to $12 million in budget cuts this year in the public schools of Worcester. So it's saving us in many, many ways. There are still discussions to be held relative to the merits of some existing programs. Do we want to put those dollars elsewhere? That's all really still in front of us. The last comment I'll make is that the area that we could find some relief this year, in the governor's proposed budget, he is not fully funding the rate for lower income students this year. If they were fully funding that rate this year, Worcester would see $6.8 million additional dollars coming in for fiscal year 21. So we'll be working on the legislative side to see if we can get that modified this year to see those dollars come in. But the last comment is there's still an awful lot of work in front of us. We are soliciting feedback from the community. We have to consider that feedback very seriously. The administration will draft a proposal that will go to the school committee for debate on March 19th. So we are expecting to make that all part, really have a strong community input that will guide our decision making. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. I was listening to the panelists, and so was remiss in my timekeeper job. So a couple of things. Clara just passed out a evaluation. If you could just take a moment to fill that out right now, that would be very helpful. And then I'm going to take a couple of questions before we adjourn.
So how do we find out about the 9 areas? Because I came today because I thought I was going to hear what the 9 areas were, so.
Okay. Fill out your evaluation, and then I'll tell you. Okay.
It's done.
Okay. Yes, Rob.
I have 2 hopefully quick questions. Jenny, if you could explain, so this grant that you gave to the city, the school department before, who the school department partnered with to actually do this evaluation of the data, understand the root causes. So that's something we've, as a community, been talking a lot about. And Jack, if you could walk through those numbers, I thought you said they were on top, and then all of a sudden we're 14 million that keeps current services. So I'm just, if you could do those numbers again.
Sure, and I can do that also offline as well if you'd like. Rob, I can talk to you about that. But I mean, the issue is that the loss of the enrollment decline. We lost $4.2 million with the enrollment decline. The inflation going up only 2%, we lost some dollars there because our costs are growing up as well. And then the biggest issue is if you want to maintain existing services, it's about $14 million. So the level of new funding we have is much less than you would expect right now. But I can go over that with you. I'll show the details right now.
Okay. Jack, would you also answer Joanne's question about the areas? The 9 areas?
I was trying to. I think I have them here. We have them all written down. We should have them memorized by now.
No, I can read them out if that would be helpful. So, number 1, expanded learning time in the form of a longer school day or school year. Number 2, increased opportunity for common planning time for teachers. Number 3, social services to support students' social, emotional, and physical health. Number 4, hiring school personnel that best support improved student performance. Number 5, increased or improved professional development. Number 6, purchase of curriculum materials and equipment that are aligned with statewide curriculum frameworks. Number 7, expanding early education and pre-kindergarten programming within the district in consultation or in partnership with community-based organizations. Number 8, diversifying the educator and administrator workforce. And number 9, developing additional pathways to strengthen college and career readiness. And then there is kind of a catch-all number 10, any other program determined to be evidence-based by the commissioner.
And we've also added facilities to that as well, given the importance of facilities.
Hilda?
What was the answer to the question about Robin?
Who partnered?
The partners, yeah. So, yeah, sure. So the project that the District of Worcester is part of is, like I said earlier, it includes 5 districts inclusive of Worcester. And BAR partnered directly with the supports to do that, do the analysis. So it wasn't hired, the support to do the deep analysis was not hired district by district. BAR partnered directly on behalf of the districts as part of the project, and that was something that was like laid out front. So the partners, I can share who the partners were. So EY Parthenon, the consulting firm, did an analysis of looking at current student high school experiences in course taking and academic results, and looked at then also matching with post-secondary data and looking at what the experiences of students are, and then backwards mapping and looking at what their experiences were in high school that matched different post-secondary outcomes that we were seeing from students, I think from the class of 2016. Kathy's nodding her head. And so that was a very rich analysis that goes beyond sort of like the basics of like who's enrolling in college, who's persisting, but really a deeper understanding of like what were the experiences of students in high school and how does that match with post-secondary success or not. And then a national organization called Spring Point, who does high school design work nationally, and BAR partners with them on several different projects, did qualitative school observation visits. Worcester got to choose 3 high schools. Each of the districts that were part of the project got to pick a sampling. Most districts had more high schools than we were able to include as part of that. So 3 high schools had deep school quality review visits with recommendations. And then we also hired a consultant to do some alumni focus groups, which was an area of interest of all the districts that were part of the project. When they applied to be part of it, one of the things we asked districts to do is talk about the data sources and research questions they had even at the beginning of the project, and almost all of them, I think all of them actually talked about alumni qualitative feedback. So those were the 3 data sources that all 5 of the districts received over the last year. Yeah.
And Hilda, you had a question?
Yeah, so my question is more for the school committee, for Jack and maybe John. So in terms of taking some money to level out what is being spent now, so then my question to that is, are we sure, or are you guys discussing in terms of, are those programs targeted to the need? Because if we look at reaching equity, right? If we're not targeting that to the real needs, then we're not going to see the improvements. So I just don't know if you guys are talking about that and how you're addressing that to make sure that the new money is really going to the kids that need it.
I mean, that's the real challenge in front of us still, I think, and given the short time frame, it's going to be hard to really have that conversation, a deep conversation about that. In some ways, I think this plan going to the state is such a high-level plan that we can probably submit something and feel pretty comfortable with what's being submitted, but the real conversation may come when the budget's discussed for next year. And in any budget, you should be looking at, all right, not only what are you going to add, but what are you going to cut? What's not working, what's really not having the impact, and let's redirect those dollars somewhere else. And that's a challenging conversation to have, but I think that's, in some ways, that's what has to happen with even the dollars, the existing programs that are not being funded next year. Are they worth continuing and funding elsewhere? Are there other programs that really aren't getting at reducing the achievement gap that unfortunately we need to pare away and put the dollars somewhere else? That's a really deep discussion that's going to take more time.
And I would just say, like, some of these programs, it's really easy to tell. Early college is a great example. Worcester has one of the largest early college programs in the state. When you look at the enrollment of students in early colleges, in almost every district, they look like the exact population you want to serve: first-time generation, first-time going college students of color, low income. And a few districts don't look like that, and that's a real problem. The data can tell us that. You know, I think I was in Holyoke the other day, their pre-K expansion program, they're reaching the low-income students who weren't in any formal structured care, and they can demonstrate that. So I think if you're investing the dollars into these evidence-based programs and providing sort of net new educational opportunity, you can tell who it hits directly.
Other questions? Yeah, Dodie? Oh, that's not Dodie, sorry.
Lines on the slide that you have that seems to point to success of students post-secondary school. And my question really is, are you also tracking those students that are successful in careers, military careers, electricians, plumbers, all of those wonderful fields that is success in career and beyond? Why is it only post-secondary degrees that you're tracking? I don't understand.
Jack, do you want to?
Well,
I mean, part of it is just data availability, if I can jump in. We don't have very good systems right now of tracking kids into the workforce. So that's part of it. I will say, you know, based on sort of the research that is out there, there is a correlation between what we see in terms of success in college and success in career fields. So it's not, the numbers are not going to look the same, and yes, we should be tracking and gathering more information. But this idea that somehow by just looking at college, we are missing all of this really critical information, and the patterns would look different, the inequity patterns would look different, I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure the research bears that out.
And, you know, and we've looked at that, yes. Well, when we look at those numbers, though, they're very small numbers. Same with the military, very small. Most students in Massachusetts, the vast majority are graduating and going on to post-secondary education, and most aren't completing from our gateway cities. So I think in the labor market piece, we don't know. We will know soon. We're working on that, but it's taken us way too long to get there, and I think it'll be interesting to see what we find.
One second, Laura, sorry. I'd just like to amplify Natasha's comment, which is the qualities, habits, and skills that it takes to be successful in college and in the workplace. There has been a confluence of those over the last several decades. The ability to think critically, the ability to write well, the skills in numeracy, skills in communication. And those are the foundational skills that will allow kids to pursue a variety of different tracks. Laura.
Yeah, I was just going to add very quickly, the Rennie Center just put out a report recently that looks at measuring student success, and one of the areas we look at is building multiple pathways to post-secondary. So we profiled Vermont, which is actually doing a really interesting thing where their state accountability plan for their high schools includes a measure of whether students are in a college and career pathway 16 months after graduation. The caveat is they don't have any way to track that currently. So they're really looking basically at the same data. So it's one of these things when Natasha's talking about data being limited, people are really trying, they're really interested. The Vermont system includes military, trade, all of the pathways you mentioned. It's really tough right now to build the systems, and it's just going to take more time to get all that data in one place, unfortunately.
Okay. One final question? Yes.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about the accountability piece. Like many other people here, we've been to multiple forums where community voice is brought to the forefront, and the problem isn't hearing our voice, it's what gets done about it, right? Like this, we've tried data, we've tried anecdotal, and we really don't, we still have an all-white school committee despite having candidates of color that were well qualified. We just don't seem to get traction, and I mean, I'm hoping we can, but thoughts about that? Sorry. That's a great comment, more than a question, but
Jack, do you want to?
I mean, I'll talk about the politics of it here, right? And I talked to a lot of the candidates who ran, and they ran great campaigns. But it's a long process. I mean, a lot of the candidates who are out this year are fairly new. And frankly, I'd like to think that people voted for us because we're so good, but it's name recognition. It really is name recognition, so that candidates have to be out there, they have to get involved in other organizations, have to be present for many years so that they're recognized across the city. It's a big city. So I hope that they go back, and they're back in the game in 2 years, and they run again. But it takes some time to build that kind of base in order to be elected. That's just pure politics of it.
But I do think that in all that large structure is going to lead to underrepresentation of people with less means. To run citywide is a challenge. And if you don't have a numerical majority, getting any seat is a challenge. So I think that's why that system faced a lawsuit in Lowell, and I think that there's no question that Worcester is susceptible to a complaint if it doesn't recognize that structural issue should proactively be resolved. So, but then say you fix that, and so now you have more representation. There still is not a good track record of elected bodies putting down goals and sticking to them, right? And that happens at all levels. I don't see the state doing that, and the governor, they're not saying we're going to move achievement up by this amount. Yeah. So, that's where I think we kind of got to change the way that we have engaged data. And we've talked a lot about this. We've been way too punitive with them, and it's made people hesitant to put anything down on paper, and because of that, we don't really do strategic work. and because of that, we don't get outcomes. I think we really got to kind of not be much different with how we engage around the data, how we treat elected leaders when they don't meet a goal. It's not the end of the world, but we should really be collaborative in building plans that make sense and making sure that we've engaged our university partners, our community partners, and so forth. So I think there's a lot of work to do there, but hopefully we kind of turned to a new chapter where we can start to talk and work in those ways. And it's going to take leadership from groups like ours.
I totally sort of second all of that. Would also add just the idea of just following up and following through, frankly. Oftentimes, you know, we go through these processes around engaging around a plan, people give their feedback. They never hear back about what the conversation was like, why the decisions that got made, and then what are the next steps, and how is this all going to roll over into the future, right? So the low-hanging fruit here is to build in some of that communication, not to sort of add work to the plate of really busy people, but I think that's part of what keeps people coming back, too.
And the strategic plan does include some of those metrics. It looks at interim data points from 2019, 21, and 23 to try to do some of that accountability building, but it is going to take more engagement and continuing, you know, conversations like this where, you know, you're bringing the numbers to the table and saying this is what we said was going to happen, have we reached that, if not, why not, and what can we do next?
All right, thank you all for being here. I am going to put on my Southern preacher hat, though, and that is nobody leaves until we have your evaluation form. Okay. I'd like to thank everyone on the panel for being here, and we are going to take a break for panelists before we start round two. Thank you, everyone, and remember, we have forums coming up. Be there.